Ari Katz is the CEO at Boston Online Home Education, and he joins us tonight to talk a little bit more about this question of equality, particularly when it comes to education. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, Ari. Always good to talk to you.
Good evening, Peter, and thanks for inviting me.
Education, one of the key pillars of any society, especially if you want to progress and prosper. But equality is perhaps one of the key pillars for us in our continent, in our country and our continent. Hello, Ari, can you hear me?
Yeah, now I can hear you. Sorry.
All right. Yes, I was just saying that equality in education must be a really, really important thing for us if we want to develop as a country and as a continent.
No, correct. So as we've just heard, I mean, I think probably the two fundamental issues that we need to address is, first of all, that learners have to be able to read for meaning. And second up, in my opinion, is basic mathematical skills. And as we just heard, only 22% of 10-year-olds in South Africa can read for meaning. We know that President Ramaphosa committed his administration that by 2030, all 10-year-olds would be able to read for meaning. However, at the moment, the projection is that only 36% of learners at the age of 10 years old will be able to read for meaning by 2030. So although this is better than the current 22%, it's a long way off from where we should be. And to me, the second issue is also basic mathematical skills. I mean, the trends for international mathematical science and study indicated that South Africa came 55 out of 58 countries, where only 41% of grade 9 learners were able to do basic mathematical calculations. So I think between the inability to read for meaning and the inability to perform basic mathematical calculations, we are only creating greater inequality in South Africa.
So how do we fix this, Ari?
So I think anybody who has that magic wand needs to stand up and be counted. However, I do think that there are certain things that we can actually do. So I think that first up, we need to look at the teacher training. I mean, what's concerning is that there was a study recently done of Bachelor of Education final year students at 3 universities. And they were given a test for a primary school mathematics. And the teachers, the budding teachers, were only able to score 54% in a primary school test themselves. So clearly, first up is to start with re-looking at our teacher training and who we're taking into those programs and what are we teaching on those programs so when they exit. So number one, I think, is teacher training. I think number two, we need to harness the resources of technology that exist. We live in 2022. There are extensive resources, things like diagnostics, where we're able to identify exactly what a learner and a teacher, quite frankly, doesn't know, and we're able to remediate that with online learning. In addition, we can use technology and infrastructure, things like adaptive learning, where we can start to learn at a basic level and they automatically move up the food chain as they become more proficient in the topic. So things like adaptive learning. We can use things like artificial intelligence, where we can do predictions as to whether students are going to be successful or not successful, and we can intervene. So I think that there are a lot of opportunities and technologies where we're missing the opportunity to actually use those technologies to actually intervene and resolve some of the problems that we have.
All right. So, I mean, there's two layers there, I guess. Access to these technologies is one of them. And as you said, actually using the technologies that are available. So how do we get the first bit right? Access to these technologies, especially in the most remote areas of our country.
So one of the things that I saw recently, that the government had made an announcement that there was a plan that all households would be given 10 gigs of free data a month. Now that would be a major step in the right direction, because if they had access to 10 gigs of free data, they would be able to access some of the technologies that we're talking about, some of those diagnostics, some of those online learning technologies, etc. But in addition to that, the government, I think, needs to make these technologies available in the classroom. So you can either do them online, like we offer it, or you can actually use those technologies in the classrooms to complement and supplement what is actually going on in the classroom environment. And I think this provides learners a great opportunity to learn at their own time, own pace, in so-called safe space, where a learner doesn't have to be embarrassed by putting up his hand and 20 other learners look at him. He can actually engage with the technology, and he can actually learn at his own time, own pace, and gain proficiency. Now, you spoke about access. So as I said, number one, the households are going to get 10 gigs of free data, or so the government is saying. And secondly, I think there needs to be a plan on a national level where all schools should actually be provided with technology and infrastructure, Wi-Fi, etc., if we want to eradicate the inequality that we're talking about.
All right. So another layer, of course, is it's all very well to have these technologies and these educational tools to employ and deploy, but you also have to have the teachers able to use them. I mean, I saw a survey recently that 54% of teachers were unable to do a primary school maths test. I mean, that's quite alarming. That's another thing that we really have to scale. Otherwise, you've got all this technology, but people who can't teach it.
So 100%. I think one of the interesting things around that survey, by the way, because that was interesting, that particular test that you're talking about was actually run at 3 separate universities. So it wasn't one particular college or university. And therefore, it indicates that that would be symptomatic across the board. But what's interesting about the TIMS, the Trends in International Maths and Science study that was done, was that the TIMS study, 2/3 of those questions are based on what we call higher order thinking, which is reasoning, application, etc., similar to the Cambridge curriculum. And I think that is one of the reasons that our learners performed so poorly in the TIMS test, because typically our curriculum is more focused on rote learning, and approximately only 1/3 of the current South African curriculum is based on higher order thinking. Now, I think that's one of the things that we also need to embrace. If we want to become internationally competitive, we need to embrace a curriculum that's based on higher order thinking, that utilizes reasoning and application as opposed to rote learning.
All right. I mean, you know, there's so many layers to this conversation that we have. And one of them, and I've got to ask about matric itself, whether that's enough, because we're seeing a high casualty rate in first year at university. And then I compare it to other countries that do O-levels and then A-levels, and they seem to transition much better into the tertiary situation. So do we need to even re-look exit points at school, and that maybe a higher standard is required at your last year of school?
So Peter, I think you've hit the nail on the head. That is actually the key issue. The question really is matric a barometer of success? And the reality is we know that the throughput rates at universities are extremely alarming. I mean, it was recently reported that only 22% of students who enter first year finish their degree or diploma within the minimum amount of time. Whereas you spoke about O-levels and A-levels. By contrast, in the Cambridge curriculum, they did a study, and that there's a 72%, I mean, that is a staggering number, there's a 72% correlation coefficient between your results at IGCSE and your subsequent results at either SATs or first year university. And I think that we need to aim for a basic education which is more, which prepares one better for tertiary education. Otherwise, you're really creating an expectation gap, because students are managing to get into universities and colleges, but they're not managing to get out in the minimum amount of time. And I think that creates disappointment, that creates frustration, and of course, that has its own consequences.
Ari Katz, it looks like there's a lot of work to be done. Let's hope that the finance minister will dig deep and find some money for us to make sure that our kids get a fighting chance. Thanks so much indeed for joining us. Always good to talk to you.
Great. Thanks, Peter. Have a good evening.
Good evening to you. That's Ari Katz from Boston Online Education, Home Education, talking to us about opportunities and challenges in the education space.